Elias Harper pushed the plow through dirt that did not want to yield. The Arizona sun, even in the morning, was a weight on his shoulders, pressing him down into the dust. He was 36 years old, but the men who had ridden with him at Shiloh would not have known his face. The war had carved lines into him, but the peace that followed had hollowed him out. His land was a harsh patch of brown, tucked against the hem of the mountains, miles from any real settlement. The locals in the sparse town of Tucson, when he rode in twice a year for salt and seed, called it Apache territory. They warned him, but Elias had stopped listening to warnings. His only company was the wind, and it spoke of nothing but drought and emptiness. And the graves, 2 of them, marked by simple wooden crosses he had fashioned from the splintered remains of his old wagon. They sat under the lone, skeletal mesquite tree that shaded his sod house. Sarah, Thomas, he did not speak to them, not anymore. He simply worked until his hands bled, ate his bacon and beans cold, and fell onto his cot, hoping the exhaustion would keep the dreams away. It rarely did. He had come west after the surrender, seeking a place where the gunfire in his head might finally go quiet. He had brought what was left of his life, his wife, hollow-eyed from the fever that took her parents, and his son, a boy of 4 who had never known a world without uniforms. The war had followed them, not the war of cannon and flags, but the war of scarcity, of bad water and bad luck. Sarah succumbed to a lung fever in their first winter. Thomas drowned in the shallow creek during a spring melt, chasing a wooden boat Elias had carved for him. Now, Elias he was a man defined by what he had lost. He avoided town because the pity in men's eyes felt like sand in his own, and the careless laughter in the saloon felt like a betrayal. His isolation was a kind of penance. He knew this land was disputed. He had seen the smoke signals, faint pillars in the high canyons. He had found Apache arrows, black-tipped and sinister, embedded in the cottonwoods by the stream. A patrol of cavalrymen had ridden past his claim just a month prior. The lieutenant, a young man with a face too clean for the territory, had reined in his horse, looking at Elias's meager cornrows with contempt. "You're a fool or a corpse, mister," the lieutenant had said, adjusting his gauntlets. "This ain't homesteader land. This is Indian land." Elias had just leaned on his plow handle, his sweat stinging his eyes. "It's my land." "It's nothing," the soldier spat. "And when they come down from those hills and lift your hair, don't expect us to find what's left." Elias had watched them ride away, a blue line disappearing into the heat. He stayed. He had buried his wife and son in this dirt. He would not leave them. He had nothing left elsewhere. The sky had been a bruised, greenish purple for 2 days. Elias knew the signs. The air was heavy, holding its breath. He had taken his wagon and mule up into the low hills, checking the few snares he'd set for rabbit. He needed the meat. The air grew thick, still and hot, clinging to his skin. He smelled the wet stone before he heard the water. It was not the sound of rain, but the sound of a mountain breaking. A roar echoed from the high canyons, a deafening grinding noise that shook the ground, a flash flood. He turned the mule, trying to get to higher ground, but it was too late. A wall of brown water, choked with debris, boulders, and uprooted trees, burst from the arroyo. It struck the wagon with the force of a train. The wood splintered. The mule screamed, a terrible sound swallowed by the thunder of the flood. Elias was thrown clear. He felt a sharp, searing crack as his head struck a rock. The world went black, filled with the impossible, suffocating cold of the mud and the roar of the water pulling him down. He did not know he had been swept from his own land, across the unmarked border, and onto tribal ground. He knew only the darkness, bleeding, shivering, and half dead. Ayoka saw him first. She pointed, her hand steady, her face impassive, a bundle of white man's rags half buried in the wet silt. Far from the wash's main path, Nashoba, her younger sister, dropped the herbs she had been gathering. They had come down from the high rocks after the storm to find what roots the water had uncovered. This was not what they sought. He was pale, his skin the color of fish belly, except for the dark, matted blood covering the side of his face. His blue shirt was torn, identifying him as one of the soldiers, or at least one of their kind. Ayoka nudged his boot with her toe. No movement. She spoke in their language, her voice low and hard. "He is dead, or soon will be. We leave him for the buzzards." Neshoba crept closer. She was fierce, but her eyes held a restless curiosity that Ayoka often mistook for weakness. She saw the man's chest move, a shallow, shuddering hitch. "He breathes," Neshoba whispered. "It is white man breath," Ayoka said. She turned to leave, pulling her blanket tighter. "Have you forgotten the smoke? Have you forgotten our cousins at Camp Grant? They are not men. They are poison. This one is not burning our village," Neshoba argued, her voice rising. She knelt beside him, brushing the wet hair from his face. He was young, not gray-haired like the leaders. His face was just a face, slack with pain. "He is hurt. He is not a soldier on a horse. He is just bleeding." Ayoka grabbed her sister's arm. "They are all soldiers on horses, even when they are sleeping, even when they are dead. We owe him nothing. He is on our land. The mountain has punished him. And if we leave him, we are the same as them," Neshoba shot back, yanking her arm free. "We are the same as the ones who leave our children to starve. I will not." Ayoka stared at her sister, her black eyes filled with a cold fire. She looked at the man, then back at the hills, listening. The world was quiet again, except for the drip of water from the rocks. She hated the weakness in her sister, but she also hated the thought of the soldiers finding him here. It would bring them closer. She made her decision. "We do not take him to the camp. We take him to the hidden cave. If he dies there. If he lives, he is your burden." It took them hours. He was a heavy man, limp and unresponsive. They dragged him, pulling him over slick rock and through thorny catclaw, his boot heels digging 2 shallow trenches in the mud. They were strong, their bodies hardened by survival. But by the time they reached the narrow opening hidden behind a curtain of ancient willow, they were breathing hard. The cave was small, but dry. It smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and the faint, musky scent of their sleeping robes. They laid him on a bed of dry grass and old pelts, away from the fire pit. Ayoka tended his wounds. She did this not with kindness, but with a cold efficiency. Her touch was rough. She washed the gash on his head with water from her skin, her fingers probing the skull. It was deep. She ground sage and a bitter root into a paste and pressed it into the wound, ignoring his low groan. Neshoba watched, holding a torch of dry ocotillo, her face tight with worry. Elias awoke to a different darkness. It was not the mud. It smelled of smoke and sage. Pain bloomed behind his eyes, a hot spike that radiated down his neck. He tried to move his arms. They were not bound, just heavy, useless. He blinked, his vision swimming. He saw shadows move against a low fire. Faces, fear, cold and immediate, seized his throat. Apache! He tried to sit up, tried to scramble back, his mind yelling for a rifle that was not there. A hand, small but strong, pressed against his chest, pushing him back down. He looked up. 2 women. They said nothing. They just watched him. The older one, her face solemn and marked by a faint scar on her chin, held a stone knife. She was not threatening him with it. She was just holding it, her knuckles white. The younger one, her eyes wide and bright in the firelight, simply stared, as if he were a strange new animal she had never seen up close. He was confused. He was in a cave. He was alive. He was a prisoner. The younger one, Neshoba, held a clay bowl to his lips. He smelled water. He drank, his throat raw. The older one, Ayoka, gestured. A hand, flat, pushing down. Stay. Then she pointed to his head, then to the ground. You fell. He lay back, his heart pounding against his ribs. He was afraid, but the fear was distant, muffled by the pounding in his head. He was too weak to fight, too weak to run. He closed his eyes, and the darkness took him again. Days passed. Or perhaps it was only one day. Time was measured by the light at the cave mouth fading and returning. He drifted in and out of fever. He saw Sarah, her face pale, reaching for him from the water. He saw his boy, Thomas, running toward him, but his legs were stuck in the mud of Shiloh. He cried out, and a cool, wet cloth would press against his forehead. When he was lucid, they were there. They moved with a silence that unnatural. Ayoka sat by the fire, scraping a hide or grinding corn, her back to him, but he knew she was listening to every breath he took. Neshoba was the one who tended him. She brought him rabbit stew in the clay bowl. It was hot, thick with wild onion and herbs he did not recognize. He was too weak to lift his head, so she held the bowl, feeding him small sips with a horn spoon. He ate. It was the first real food he had tasted in what felt like a lifetime. It burned a clean line down to his empty stomach. He saw the kindness in the younger one's gestures, but he saw the wariness in the older one's eyes. He heard them whispering. Their language was a mystery, soft and flowing, broken by sharp, guttural clicks. He could not understand the words, only the tones. Ayoka's voice was always sharp, questioning, suspicious. Neshoba's was softer, insistent, pleading. They were arguing about him. He was the center of a debate he could not comprehend. He looked at his hands. They were clean. His wound had been bound with soft deer hide and packed with herbs. They had saved him. The people the lieutenant had called savages, the ones who were supposed to lift his hair, had saved him from the mountain. The contradiction was too much for his aching head. On what he thought was the fourth day, the fever broke. He woke up sweating, but his mind was clear. The pain was a dull throb, no longer a spike. He was weak, but he was himself. Neshoba was mending a basket near the fire. Ayoka was gone, likely hunting or gathering. Elias cleared his throat. The sound was a dry rattle. Neshoba froze. Her hand stopped moving on the basket. She looked at him, her eyes wide. He tried to push himself up on one elbow. He started. At that moment, Ayoka entered the cave, carrying a brace of skinned rabbits. She saw him sitting up. She saw his mouth open. She dropped the rabbits, and her hand flew to the flint knife at her belt. Elias stopped, raising a hand. It trembled. He looked at both of them. His voice was rough, barely a whisper. "I am sorry." He did not know what else to say. Sorry for trespassing. Sorry for being a white man. Sorry for being alive. I mean no harm, he added, his gaze fixed on the dirt floor. Ayoka flinched as if he had struck her. The sound of his voice, the English words, seemed to cause her physical pain. Her face hardened, the scar on her chin turning white. She gripped the knife, breathing hard, her eyes filled with a sudden, terrible memory. Neshoba, however, did not move. She did not reach for a weapon. She tilted her head, her curiosity overcoming her fear. She listened. She watched his face, studying the lines of pain around his mouth, the exhaustion in his eyes. He did not sound like the soldiers who shouted. He sounded like a man apologizing to a god he was not sure existed. Ayoka said something sharp, a warning, pulling Neshoba's attention. Elias let his head fall back onto the pelt. The effort had drained him. He closed his eyes. The image of Ayoka's hatred and Neshoba's curiosity burned into his mind. Outside, miles away, the forest was not as quiet. A cavalry patrol moved through the wet trees, tracking the edge of the floodwaters. Corporal Davis, a man who had tracked Comanche in Texas, knelt by a stream where the water ran clear. He was looking for signs of the Apache band that had stolen rifles from a supply wagon 3 weeks earlier. He grunted, pointing. The mud was soft. There were 2 sets of tracks, washed out but visible. One was the small, distinct print of a woman's moccasin. Beside it, pressed deep into the silt, was the unmistakable heel-iron mark of a U.S. Army cavalry boot. Davis looked up at the high canyons, his jaw tightening. "They're mixing," he said to the lieutenant. "Or one of ours is dead." The lieutenant nodded, his clean face hardening. "Find them! Find them both. The patrol moved on, fanning out, their eyes scanning the rocks. The gash on Elias Harper's head healed slowly, closing from a raw, weeping wound to a tight, puckered scar that pulled at his hairline. His ribs still ached with every breath, a sharp reminder of the rocks. But it was his leg that had taken the worst of it. A deep, twisting break above the ankle, the bone badly set by the flood, or perhaps not set at all. Ayoka had bound it with stiff hides and willow bark, her touch firm and impersonal. But the damage was done. After a week, he could stand. He leaned on a sturdy branch Neshoba had brought him, his knuckles white. The first step was a lance of fire. He gritted his teeth, the sweat breaking out on his forehead. He would not cry out. He would not show them more weakness than they had already seen. He practiced walking in the small confines of the cave, back and forth, dragging the leg. Ayoka watched him, her dark eyes missing nothing. She saw the pain he tried to hide, the grim set of his jaw. He would not be a fast man. Not ever again. The limp was permanent, a part of him now, like the graves on his farm. Neshoba watched him with a different expression. Her curiosity was now mixed with a clear, undisguised pity, which he found harder to bear than Ayoka's suspicion. He gained strength from their food, the rabbit stew, the roasted corn, the bitter, nourishing tea. His body, starved for months on his own meager supplies, began to mend. The hollows in his cheeks filled out. The strength returned to his arms. One morning, he stood by the cave entrance, looking out at the high canyon walls. The air was clean, washed by the storm. He felt the weight of their care as a debt he could not repay. He turned, leaning on his stick. Both sisters were inside, grinding herbs on a flat stone. "I can leave now," he said, his voice quiet but firm. I'm able to walk. I thank you. For my life." He expected a reaction, a nod, a gesture to the exit. Relief. He received nothing. Ayoka did not stop the rhythmic grinding of the stone. Neshoba looked at him. Her lips parted. A look of surprise, perhaps, or sadness. She glanced at her sister. Ayoka said something sharp in their tongue. Neshoba looked down, her hair falling forward to hide her face. Elias stood there, a man dismissed. His words, his offer, had evaporated into the smoke of their small fire. He felt a fool. He was not their guest. He was not their prisoner. He was cargo, something they had salvaged and did not yet know what to do with. That evening, Neshoba brought him his bowl of stew, just as she always did. He took it, the warm clay a comfort in his hands. His offer had been ignored. He understood. He was to stay until they decided otherwise. The silence between the sisters, however, had grown. Elias, with nothing to do but watch and heal, saw the tension in their shoulders. He saw the quick, angry whispers when they thought he was asleep. Ayoka was afraid. She saw the way Neshoba watched the white man. She saw her sister sit just a little closer to him by the fire, saw her mend his torn shirt with a delicate stitch, a care she did not show for her own moccasins. One afternoon, when Elias had limped down to the small spring at the back of the cave to clean his bowl, Ayoka grabbed her sister's arm and pulled her outside, into the harsh sunlight. "He is not a stray dog, little sister," Ayoka said, her voice a low, furious hiss. "You cannot feed him and make him a pet." "He is not a pet," Neshoba retorted, trying to pull free. "He is hurt. He is—" "Quiet. He is a white man," Ayoka said, her grip tightening. "Have you forgotten? Do you not remember our mother?" Neshoba froze. The fight went out of her. Ayoka's face was stone. She went to the town, to trade. She took the best blankets. She smiled at them. She thought because she was peaceful, they would be. Ayoka's thumb dug into Neshoba's arm. A soldier saw her. He smiled back. He and 2 others. They took her behind the stables. When our uncle went to find her, they beat him and called him a thief. We never saw her again. Neshoba was breathing hard, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. "No white man stays unless he wants something," Ayoka said, her voice breaking with the old, cold grief. "They smile And then they take. This one is no different. He is just weak. He waits. When he is strong, he will take. He will take from you. Because you are young and foolish and you offer. Neshoba said nothing. She ripped her arm from Ayoka's grasp and ran, scrambling up the rocks, disappearing into the cover of the junipers. Ayoka watched her go, her heart a cold knot. She turned and looked back at the cave where the man was. She hated him. She hated him for being weak, for being male, and for being the color of the men who had burned her world. Elias could not be still. It was not in his nature. He was a farmer, a man whose hands were his purpose. To sit and be tended, to be a burden, was a kind of shame. He began to help. He did not ask. He simply did. One morning, he saw Neshoba struggling with a large carrying basket. Its weave split near the bottom. She cast it aside in frustration. When she left the cave to gather wood, Elias picked it up. His hands were large, calloused from the plow and the rifle, but they were not clumsy. He had mended harness and tackle, carved his son's toys, woven his own fences. He found a stray piece of cured hide and a sharp bit of flint. He sat for an hour, his bad legs stretched out, and carefully, patiently, he restitched the seam and reinforced the weave. He set it back where he had found it. When Neshoba returned, she saw the basket. She stopped, her arms full of wood. She picked it up, running her fingers over his repair. It was solid, strong. She looked at him, her eyes wide. He was cleaning the fire pit, stacking the loose rocks to form a neater, safer ring. He worked quietly. He never imposed. He was a shadow, a presence that fixed what was broken. He scraped the soot from the cooking stones. He organized the wood pile, stacking it by size. He saw their water skin was low and, taking it and his stick, he limped to the spring and filled it. His every step a study in controlled pain. Ayoka watched this all. It troubled her. It was women's work. It was the work of a captive. But he was not a captive. He did not work with his head down, sullen and afraid. He worked as a man works his own home. He was restoring order. He was repaying his debt in the only currency he had. It made him harder to hate. A man who worked without boasting, who saw a need and met it, was not a man she understood. He did not fit the shape of the monsters in her memory. The deer changed things. It came in the night during a cold, hard rain that kept them all huddled deep in the cave. They heard it first, a desperate scrambling on the rocks near the entrance. Then a heavy fall, followed by a low, agonizing bleat. Elias was on his feet first, grabbing his stick. Ayoka had her knife in her hand, Neshoba huddled by the fire, her eyes on the darkness. Ayoka moved toward the entrance, her knife held low. Elias followed, his limp pronounced. In the mouth of the cave, just out of the rain, lay a young buck, its leg bent at an impossible angle, its side ripped open, dark blood steaming on the cold stone. A cougar, likely, scared off by their scent. The animal was in misery. It tried to lift its head, its dark eyes rolling in terror. Neshoba let out a small, piteous sound. Ayoka raised her knife, her face set, ready to cut its throat. It was meat. It was a gift. But Elias moved past her. He laid a hand on the animal's neck. It flinched, but he held it steady. "Easy now," he whispered, his voice low and calm. "Easy, son. It's all right. It's over now." The deer shuddered, but the voice, the strange, gentle words, seemed to calm it. It stopped struggling. Ayoka paused, her knife in the air. She watched him. He was not talking to them. He was talking to the deer. Elias looked at her, his eyes meeting hers in the firelight. He didn't gesture for her knife. He pulled his own small whittling knife from his pocket. It was barely 3 inches long. He put his left hand on the deer's head, covering its eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Then, with one quick motion, he found the artery in its neck. It was not a butcher's hack. It was a clean, precise cut. The deer convulsed once, a great, final shudder, and then was still. The life went out of its eyes. Elias stayed there for a long moment, his hand on the animal's cooling hide. He looked sad. He looked tired. Ayoka slowly lowered her arm. She had seen white men hunt. She had seen the bluecoats ride through herds of bison, shooting from their horses, laughing as the great beasts fell, leaving them to rot in the sun. They killed for sport, for the noise. They celebrated the blood. This man, this Elias, had helped the deer die. He had shown it respect. He had been quiet, and he had been clean. He now stepped back, his face grim, and looked at Ayoka. He gestured to the buck. "It is yours," he said. He turned and limped back to his corner, sitting down, his back to them. He stared at the cave wall, leaving them to their kill. Ayoka did not move for a long time. She stared at the deer, then at the back of the white man. Her certainty was cracking. The silence around the fire grew less heavy in the following days. The deer provided meat, and the shared, strange intimacy of its death had broken a barrier. They sat together in the evenings, the three of them, the rain still drumming outside. Elias felt he owed them more than just mended baskets. He owed them an explanation. He held his hands out to the fire, his palms scarred from the plow. "My home," he said, gesturing vaguely to the east. Was near here." Neshoba watched him, her chin resting on her knees. Ayoka pretended to be sharpening her knife, but she was listening. "I had a wife," he said. The word felt strange in his mouth, like a prayer he had forgotten. "Sarah. Her name was Sarah." He paused, searching for the simple words. "Fever. In the winter. The cold. It got in her lungs." He looked into the flames. "We had a son, Thomas." A small, involuntary smile touched his lips, then vanished. He was 4 years old. He stopped. The next part was hard. The creek, by our house. It flooded. From the melt. He could not say drowned. He just shook his head, the memory closing his throat. "He is with his mother." He looked at Ayoka, his eyes meeting her dark, steady gaze. "I am tired," he said, the words coming from a place deeper than his bones. "I am tired of violence, of fighting, the war. It was too much noise, too much." He looked down at his hands. "I am not a soldier, not anymore. I am just a farmer with no farm." Neshoba had been listening, her brow furrowed. She had seen his sadness. Now it had a shape, a wife, a child, gone, like her mother, like her cousins. She leaned forward, her voice soft, her broken English hesitant. "Your towns, white towns." Elias looked at her, surprised by the question. "Your men," she said, her voice rising slightly, searching for the word. "They hit women. Your women?" Elias was stunned by the directness of it. It was a child's question, blunt and terrible. He thought of the men in Tucson, of the drunken brawls he'd seen spilling from the saloons. He thought of the cruel laughter, of the hard-eyed men who saw everything as something to be taken. He could not lie to her. "Some do," he said, his voice heavy. "Some men are broken. They are bad. They hurt what they should protect." He saw Ayoka's head lift, a look of dark confirmation in her eyes. "But not all," Elias added, his voice firm. He looked directly at Neshoba. "My father, he never raised a hand to my mother, and I—" He thought of Sarah, of her pale, tired face. "No, good men do not—" The honesty of his answer, the admission of his own people's cruelty, settled in the cave. It was more powerful than a denial would have been. Ayoka stopped sharpening her knife. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. He had not defended his kind. He had spoken the truth. She said something to Neshoba, a quiet command. Neshoba got up. She went to a small pouch hanging from a peg of rock. She took out a pinch of dried, dark green leaves. She brought them to the pot of water by the fire. She showed Elias how she crushed them in her palm, how she let them steep in the hot water. The aroma was sharp, like pine and mint. Ayoka watched, and for the first time, she did not correct her sister. She nodded. "Show him." Neshoba poured the tea into a cup and handed it to Elias. He took it. The tea was bitter, but clean, and it warmed him from the inside. They were sharing something of theirs. A ritual, a medicine. He sipped it, then looked at them. The firelight played on their dark hair, their high cheekbones. "My name," he said, touching his own chest. "My name is Elias." Nashoba tried the sound. As. It was slow, careful. "Elias." She smiled. A quick, bright flash of teeth. Elias nodded. "Elias?" He looked at Ayoka. She just held his gaze, her face unreadable. Then she gave a single, small nod. She had heard, that night. Elias slept. But Ayoka did not. She sat by the dying embers, her blanket pulled around her shoulders. The rain had finally stopped, and a sliver of moon cast a pale, sick light into the cave. She watched Elias sleep. He was on his back, his mouth slightly open. His breath was heavy, a slight whistle from his broken nose. His face, in repose, was just a face. The lines of pain were smoothed out. He looked younger. The firelight shifted. A shadow fell across his cheek. Suddenly, Ayoka was not in the cave. She was 8 years old, hiding in a thorny mesquite bush. The air was not cold, it was hot, filled with smoke that burned her lungs. The screaming, it was so loud. Bluecoats on horses, their faces red, shouting in their ugly language. They were setting fire to the kish, the winter homes, the smell of burning baskets. Burning corn, burning everything. She saw her mother, dragged by the hair by a man with a yellow stripe on his trousers. The man's face was in shadow, but the firelight, it caught his face, just as it now caught the face of the sleeping man. Ayoka gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She was back in the cave. It was cold. The man was just Elias. He was sleeping. He had lost his wife and child. He had killed the deer with respect. He had admitted his people were bad, but he looked like them. Her heart was a battle. Her memory screamed monster. Her eyes saw a man. He bled like them. He grieved like them. He was still here. And she had not killed him. She had fed him. She had helped him heal. What did it mean? What had she done? The rain returned near dawn. A cold, steady drizzle that would last for days. It kept them trapped. The cave felt smaller, the air thick with their breathing, with the smell of smoke and damp fur. They slept close, not for intimacy, but for warmth. Elias was aware of them. He was aware of Nashoba's warmth, of the sound of her breathing just a few feet away. He kept his back to them, facing the cold stone wall, a gesture of respect, of distance. But Nashoba, she was not a child. She was a woman, and she was curious. The man, Elias, was not a monster. He was sad. He was quiet. And he was here. That night, she brought him his sleeping pelt. He was already lying down, facing the wall, pretending to be asleep. He felt her presence behind him. She did not just drop the pelt. She spread it over him, her hands brushing his shoulders. He froze. She knelt beside him. He could feel her warmth, smell the faint, clean scent of sage in her hair. He kept his eyes shut, his breath held. She leaned close, so close her hair brushed his ear and his scarred cheek. He felt her breath. She whispered. The words were barely air, spoken in her halting, careful English. "We never touched a white man before." Her breath shook when she said it. It was not an invitation. It was a confession, a statement of fact, heavy with fear and a profound, dangerous longing. Elias did not move. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard he was sure she could hear it. He did not breathe. He pretended he was asleep. He pretended he had not heard, but he had. He heard the terror in her voice, and he heard the curiosity, and he knew, as he lay there in the dark, that the ground beneath them, which had already been broken by flood and violence, had just shifted again, in a way that would undo them all. Ayoka smelled the smoke 2 mornings in a row. It was not the scent of their own small, carefully contained fire. This was the thin, greasy smell of bacon fat and bad coffee, the smell of a cavalry camp, carried on the high, cold wind. The bluecoats were moving, sweeping the canyons, their net drawing tighter. She returned to the cave, her face grim. She kicked dirt onto their fire, extinguishing it without a word. The message was clear. They were moving. Elias had dreaded this. He got to his feet, using his stick as a brace. His ankle was a knot of old fire, the bones badly mended, and the damp cold had settled deep into the joint. "I can walk," he said, before she could even look at him with doubt. Ayoka met his gaze. She had seen him practice, seen the way his face went pale with each step. She gave a short, sharp nod. He would have to. The journey was a quiet hell. They moved deeper into the mountains, away from the known trails, climbing ridges of sharp, volcanic rock that tore at Elias's boots and the sisters' moccasins. Ayoka led, moving with a mountain goat's certainty. Neshoba stayed close to Elias, her eyes constantly scanning the rocks above, her hand sometimes hovering near his elbow, as if expecting him to fall. He did fall. Twice. The first time, his stick slipped on a patch of wet scree, and he went down hard, his bad leg twisting beneath him. A sound, a raw grunt of pain, was forced from his throat. He was on his hands and knees, breathing hard, the world graying at the edges. Neshoba rushed to him. Ayoka turned, her face impassive, her knife in her hand, scanning their back trail. She expected the noise to bring soldiers. "I'm all right," Elias panted, pushing Neshoba's hands away gently. "I'm all right." He used the rock face to haul himself up. His trouser leg was wet with fresh blood where the skin over his ankle had split. He set his jaw, took a breath, and put his weight back on the stick. "I can walk." He did not look at them. He just started moving, dragging the leg, leaving a small, dark smear on the stone. Ayoka watched him. The white men she knew would have cursed. They would have blamed the mountain, or blamed the women for moving too fast. They would have demanded rest. This man simply bled and kept walking. She turned and continued the climb. Their new shelter was not a cave. It was a scar in the rock, a deep fissure eroded by wind, barely hidden by a curtain of ancient, stringy-barked juniper. It was half the size of the cave, a tight, triangular space that forced them into unbearable closeness. It was dry, but the wind howled past the opening, a constant, mournful sound. And then the rain began. It was not a storm, but a cold, steady, soaking siege that lasted for days. The world beyond the rock fissure dissolved into a gray, weeping sheet of water. The temperature dropped. The small fire they dared to build offered little warmth and filled the cramped space with smoke that stung their eyes. They were trapped. 3 people in a space meant for one. They sat with their knees almost touching. At night, sleep was not a release, but a different kind of trial. There was only one patch of dry ground. They slept huddled together, a tangle of limbs and blankets, purely for survival, to share the body heat that stood between them and a lung fever. Elias lay stiffly on his side, his back to the cold rock wall, his bad leg aching. Ayoka lay on his other side, her back to him, a rigid line of distrust. Neshoba slept pressed against her sister, or sometimes, in the dark, she would shift, her body rolling to press against Elias's. The tension was a living thing. It was in the air they breathed, thick with the smell of wet wool, damp leather, sage, and the undeniable, clean scent of the women's hair. Elias would lie awake for hours. Every point of contact a brand. He felt Neshoba's soft breath on his shoulder, felt the slight, involuntary shift of Ayoka's body as she dreamed. He was surrounded by a warmth he had not known since Sarah, and it felt like a profound sin. One afternoon, the rain slackened to a miserable drizzle. They sat by the smoky fire, their hands occupied with small tasks. Ayoka was restitching a moccasin. Elias was checking the edge of his small knife. Neshoba sat before him, watching his hands. His hands were a map of his life. A long, pale scar ran from his thumb to his wrist, a souvenir from a Confederate bayonet at Antietam. His knuckles were thick, scarred from the plow, The skin cracked and stained with dirt. Neshoba reached out, her movement slow, tentative. She touched the back of his hand with one finger. Elias froze. His entire body went rigid. Ayoka's hand stopped moving on the moccasin. Her head was down, but her eyes, dark and sharp, lifted, watching from under her brow. Neshoba. Her face open with the simple curiosity of a child touching a strange pattern, traced the pale line of the bayonet scar. Her finger was warm. She traced the hard, calloused ridges of his knuckles. He had not flinched, had not pulled away. He stayed perfectly still, honoring the gesture, though his heart was a drum against his ribs. She looked up. Meeting his eyes, he saw no flirtation in her gaze, only a deep, questioning wonder. This hand was so different from hers, so large, so broken. Ayoka made a low sound in her throat. Not quite a word. A warning. Neshoba pulled her hand back quickly, as if burned. She grabbed her water skin and scrambled out of the shelter, disappearing into the gray mist. Elias let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. He looked at Ayoka. She was stitching again, her stitches too tight, pulling the hide so hard the sinew threatened to snap. He said nothing. He turned his attention back to his knife, but his hand was trembling. Sleep became his enemy. He had buried his grief for Sarah and Thomas in the hard, unforgiving soil of his farm, burying it so deep he thought it was dead. But this new fragile life in the dark, this closeness, it had unearthed everything. He began to dream. He dreamed of the cave, but it was warm, and the fire was bright. He dreamed of hair, black and smelling of pine, tangled across his chest. He dreamed of bodies, not in the stiff, chaste huddle for warmth, but moving, soft and yielding. He dreamed of Neshoba's curious fingers and Ayoka's watching eyes, and in the dream, their eyes were not filled with suspicion, but with a matching, aching need. He dreamed of belonging, of not being alone, of a warmth that was not just survival, but life. He would wake in the cold, pre-dawn dark, his body aching with a longing that left him hollow and ashamed. He felt the light press of Neshoba's shoulder against his and the steady breathing of Ayoka just beyond, and he felt like a thief. He was betraying his dead wife with the very women who had saved his life. He would slip out of the shelter, standing in the cold drizzle, his hands braced on the rock, until the guilt and the desire cooled to the familiar, dull ache of his solitude. One morning, the rain finally stopped. The clouds broke, and a weak, watery sun illuminated the canyon. Ayoka declared they were low on food. She would hunt the higher ridges. Neshoba would check the snares they had set in the valley. Elias was mending his torn blanket near the fire. Neshoba gathered her basket, her movements quick and nervous. She had been quiet ever since she touched his hand, avoiding his gaze. She paused at the entrance to the shelter, her silhouette framed against the new, bright light. Elias looked up. Their eyes met. He saw a storm of confusion in her face, fear, curiosity, and a sudden, defiant decision. Before he could speak, before he could even move, she crossed the small space in 2 steps. She knelt in front of him, grabbed his jaw with a hand that was surprisingly strong, and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was hard, fast, and clumsy. A desperate pressing of her mouth to his. It tasted of smoke and wild onion and a startling, raw innocence. It lasted only a second. Then she was gone. She ripped herself away, her eyes wide with her own boldness, and fled. Scrambling down the rocks without looking back, Elias was left stunned, his hand rising to touch his lips, the place her mouth had been burned. He heard Ayoka shifting behind him. He did not need to turn to know she had seen it. He had not moved, had not responded, but he knew, in that moment. It did not matter. He was a dead man. He spent the day in a fog, his mind replaying the moment. He cleaned the fire pit. He sharpened every tool they had. He waited. Ayoka returned at dusk, a single rabbit dangling from her hand. Her face was a mask of thunder. Neshoba did not return. She would stay out, checking the snares until the last light, too afraid to face her sister. Ayoka skinned the rabbit with vicious, efficient movements. Elias sat by the fire, his back straight, his bad leg throbbing. He would not hide. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of the knife on hide. Finally, when the rabbit was spitted over the fire, Ayoka spoke. She did not look at him. She stared into the flames, her voice a low, lethal whisper. "Did you touch her?" "No," Elias said. His voice was steady. It had the simple, unadorned power of the truth. "She kissed you," Ayoka stated. It was not a question. "Yes, and you let her—" I did not know it was coming," Elias said, his shame mixing with frustration. "It was over before I could move." Ayoka finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were not just angry. They were filled with a terrible, ancient pain. "She is a child. She is a woman," Elias said quietly. "But yes, I know. I did not ask for it." Ayoka laughed, a harsh, dry sound with no humor. "You asked just by being here, by being a man, by being white." She turned back to the fire. "You do not know," she whispered, the anger draining away, leaving something colder and sadder. "She is untouched by any man." She poked the fire, sending a shower of sparks into the smoke. "Our men are gone. They are dead from the bluecoat guns, or they are dead from the poison they drink in the reservation towns." Her voice grew thick. "The elders, the old women, they look at us. They say we are unclean. They say the spirits abandoned us. That is why the soldiers did not take us. That is why we are still here, with no husbands, no children. We are nothing, cursed." She looked at him, her eyes burning in the firelight. "We have seen our people cut down. We have seen our mothers taken. We have hidden in the dirt and prayed for a death that did not come. And she sees you." The accusation hung in the air. He was the sum of all the men who had destroyed her world. "But you—" Ayoka continued, her voice dropping, her gaze turning inward, as if solving a puzzle. "You are not like them. You do not boast. You do not laugh." She looked at his bad leg. "You bleed, like us." She had not just accused him. She had defined him. He was not a conqueror. He was damaged, an outcast, just as they were. In that moment, he understood their isolation. It was not just from the white world. It was from their own, as well. The weight of their shared tragedy settled on him. He had to make her understand. He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "Ayoka," he said, using her name for the first time. She flinched, but did not stop him. "I am not here to take," he said, his voice raw with an intensity that matched her own. "I buried my wife. I buried my son. I came to this land to be finished. I have nothing left to take. I would rather have died in that flood than bring you, or her, more pain. I would rather die than hurt either of you." He met her gaze and held it. There was no lie in him. It was a vow, sworn in the smoke, in the shadow of the mountain. Ayoka stared at him for a long, heavy minute. She saw his truth. She saw the graves in his eyes. She said nothing. She turned back to the rabbit. Her shoulders slumped. The anger was gone, replaced by a weary, terrible confusion. Neshoba returned long after dark. She crept into the shelter, her face averted, and laid 2 small, thin rabbits by the fire. She did not look at Elias. She did not look at Ayoka. She huddled in the farthest, coldest corner, pulling her blanket over her head. The tension was a blade. The air was so thick with unspoken words, with desire and fear and grief, that Elias felt he could not breathe. They ate the meat in silence. That night, Elias lay on his side, his body rigid. He heard Neshoba crying, small, muffled sobs from her corner. He heard Ayoka's steady, rhythmic breathing, and knew she was not asleep. He closed his eyes, praying for a sleep that would not come. He felt a movement. Neshoba had left her corner. He felt her presence behind him, a column of warmth and misery. She did not whisper. She did not touch him. She just lay down. She pressed her body against his back, from his shoulders to his knees. She was shaking, her body cold from the corner. She was not offering desire. She was seeking refuge. She was a child seeking comfort from the only two people left in her world, her sister, who was angry, and the man who was the cause. Elias did not move. His vow echoed in his head. I would rather die than hurt you. To push her away would be a cruelty, a rejection that would break her. To hold her, to turn to her, would be a betrayal of that same vow. So he remained still. He became stone. He let her borrow his warmth, his stillness, his strength. He could feel her trembling slowly subside. He felt her breathing deepen as she finally fell into an exhausted sleep. He lay awake, every nerve alive, his back burning where she touched him. From the shadows, Ayoka watched. She saw her sister, huddled against the white man like a lost fawn. She saw Elias, his back rigid, his hands fisted by his chest. He did not move. He did not touch her. He just endured. She looked at them, this broken, impossible trio. Her sister's desperate, foolish heart, the white man's iron restraint, and she, in the shadows, torn. She wanted to rip Neshoba away, to protect her from a pain she could not yet imagine. But she also saw he was protecting her, in his own way, and a part of her, a part she hated, was cold, too. A part of her envied the simple, human warmth her sister was stealing. The firelight danced on their faces, the only movement in a tableau of pain, desire, and a desperate, unspoken need, miles away, in a cold, abandoned camp. Corporal Davis lit a match. He held it close to the ground, illuminating the ashes of a fire pit. The tracks were clear, 2 sets of moccasins. He sifted through the dirt, his gloved fingers finding something. He pulled it out and held it up to the lieutenant. It was not a bead this time. It was a single, long strand of dark hair, caught on a piece of scorched deer hide. It was almost black, but in the matchlight, it shone a deep, rich brown. It was not Apache hair. He found something else, a small, brass button, the kind used on a farmer's canvas trousers. The lieutenant looked from the hair to the button. He's not a prisoner, he said, his voice hard. He's a traitor. He mounted his horse. They're moving slow. The man with the limp. Silas Shuck McCaffrey figured the information was worth at least a bottle of good whiskey, and maybe $20 in silver. He rode his mule hard into Tucson, the animal's ribs heaving, and tied it outside the Pima Saloon. The place was loud, thick with the smell of stale beer, unwashed men, and cheap tobacco. He saw them in the back, a knot of blue uniforms around a table. Shuck, named for the corn husk-colored, rotting teeth he kept, pushed his way through the prospectors and cowhands. Captain Brody was there, a man whose authority came from his Eastern family and not his skill, his face already flushed with drink. Captain, Shuck said, pulling off his hat, revealing a damp, bald head. Brody looked up, annoyed. What is it, trapper? Can't you see I'm at leisure? I got information. Captain, information you'll want. Shuck leaned in, his voice dropping. I've been running my line up in the Chiricahuas, near the high peaks. Indian sign? A corporal asked. Bored. More than sign, Shuck whispered, his small eyes bright. I seen 'em. 2 Apache squaws. Young ones. Brody grunted. Squaws ain't worth the powder. Shuck, get out of here. Ah, Shuck said, holding up a finger. But they ain't alone. That's the thing. They're with a white man. The table went quiet. Brody's eyes narrowed. What kind of man? A man with a limp, Shuck said, playing his card. A gimpy fella. He's holed up with 'em. I saw him moving camp. Saw him clear as day. 2 days back. Brody slammed his glass down. He remembered the reports from Corporal Davis, the boot print, the strange, light-colored hair. A traitor, that farmer, Harper. That's what I figured, Shuck said, smiling. Living with him, lying with him. I reckon. Saw him at a distance, up near the high ridge. They're moving slow, on account of him. Where? Brody demanded. Shuck shook his head. Information costs, Captain, say, $20 for the whereabouts of a trader and 2 savages. Brody's eyes were cold. $10 in silver and a bottle of this swill. And you ride with us. You point them out. Shuck thought for a moment, then nodded. Done, Captain. You buy the bottle first. They're moving north, toward the peaks. They won't be hard to find. The gunshot was faint, a sharp crack that echoed off the high canyon walls. Thin and distant, but Elias Harper knew the sound. It was not the heavy boom of a buffalo gun. It was a cavalry carbine. He was on his feet instantly, his hand grabbing his walking stick. Ayoka was already at the mouth of the rock fissure, her head tilted, sniffing the air. Another shot, closer this time, and then a third. Soldiers, Elias said, his voice flat. Ayoka turned, her face a mask of cold decision. She kicked dirt onto their small fire, extinguishing the last wisp of smoke. We move, higher, into the rocks where the horses cannot follow. Elias looked at his leg. He looked at the steep, treacherous climb above them. The last journey had nearly killed him. No, she glared at him, her eyes fierce. They will find us, the trapper, or others. They are hunting. We move now. They are expecting us to go higher, Elias argued, his voice urgent. He limped to the opening, standing beside her. They are sweeping the canyons. They're driving us up into a trap. We'll be caught on a bare rock with nowhere to run. He shook his head. We won't survive it. I can't make that climb. Not fast enough. Neshoba, who had been huddled by the fire, looked at them, her face pale with terror. Where, Elias? Where do we go? Down, Elias said, his mind racing. We go down. We go under them. While they are looking up, we go to the flatland. We go to my farm. Ayoka looked at him as if he were insane. To the white man's world? To your house? They will look there. They already have, Elias said, his voice gaining strength. He grabbed Ayoka's arm. They warn me. They think I'm a fool, but they think I'm alone. They're hunting in the hills. Ayoka, this is where they believe you are. The last place they will look for us is my home. It is the one place I know. There is a place to hide, a cellar, under the ground. Ayoka stared at him, her mind weighing the 2 impossible choices. The high rocks, where the soldiers were already firing, with a man who could not climb, or the lowlands, a desperate, insane gamble that moved away from the hunt. She saw the logic in it. The hunter does not look behind him. She gave a single, sharp nod. We go. Now. The journey down was a different kind of agony. The descent jolted his bad leg, sending fire up his hip with every step. But they moved with a desperate speed. They had to pass the arroyo, the site of the flood, the place where his old life had ended and this new, strange one had begun. Elias paused, looking at the debris field, the splintered wood of his wagon half buried in the sun-baked mud. Wait, he whispered. He scrambled over the rocks, his hands digging at the wreckage. He had packed his Springfield rifle in a heavy oilcloth, hoping to protect it from the elements. He found the bundle wedged beneath a broken axle. He tore the cloth open. The rifle was there. The stock was scarred, the barrel caked in dry mud. But the action had been protected. He found the small tin of cartridges, also wrapped. He checked the breech. It was gritty, but it was clear. It was a chance. It was a heavy, solid weight of hope. They moved on, following the dry wash as it broadened. The terrain was broken, cut by smaller ravines. Ayoka was in the lead, Elias close behind, Neshoba following him. They came to a deep, steep-sided cut, its banks slick with mud from the last rain. Ayoka crossed it, light as a deer. Elias jammed his stick into the bank and began to slide down, his bad leg held out stiffly. Neshoba, trying to hurry, her eyes on their back trail, misjudged her footing. Her foot slipped on a patch of wet clay. She cried out, a high, sharp sound that was swallowed by the ravine. She tumbled, rolling over rock and brush, landing in a heap at the bottom. Elias was at her side in a second. sliding the last few feet. Ayoka was there just as fast, her knife in her hand, her eyes scanning the ridge. Neshoba was not getting up. She was clutching her other ankle, her face white, her teeth clenched. She was crying, but not making a sound, the tears just rolling in hot, silent streams down her dusty cheeks. Ayoka felt the joint. Her touch was swift, practiced. The ankle was already swelling, turning a sick, bluish color. "It is broken," Ayoka said. Her voice was flat. It was a death sentence. Elias looked at Neshoba, her face a mask of pain and despair. He looked up the far side of the ravine, a steep, 10-foot wall of dirt and roots. He looked at Ayoka. "No," he said. He did not hesitate. He sheathed his own small knife. He shoved the heavy Springfield rifle into Ayoka's hands. "Hold this." Ayoka took it. The weapon was heavy in her grasp. Her eyes met his. He was trusting her with his fire, his only true defense. It was a greater intimacy than a touch. She held it, her knuckles white. Elias turned to Neshoba. "Put your arms around my neck," he said, his voice gentle. She did, her hands locking at his nape. He braced himself. "Hold tight." He bent, his own legs screaming in protest, and lifted her. He grunted, the sound forced from his chest, and settled her onto his back, her legs dangling, her weight pressing him down. He looked at the far bank. He jammed his stick into the dirt, found a foothold, and began to climb. It was a terrible, quiet battle. His bad leg trembled, threatening to buckle, unable to find purchase. He used his arms, his shoulders, his good leg, dragging himself and his burden up the slick wall. His breath came in raw, tearing sobs. He was not just fighting the ravine, he was fighting his own broken body. Ayoka watched from below, the rifle held at the ready, her face carved from stone. She watched him strain, his face purple with effort, his muscles cording. He slipped, his good foot sliding, and they both fell afoot, his body shielding Neshoba's. He held on, his fingers digging into the earth, and started again. He reached the top. He staggered, stumbling forward, and gently, so gently, set Neshoba down on the flat ground. He collapsed against a rock, his chest heaving, his eyes closed, his face slick with sweat and dirt. Neshoba just looked at him, her breath catching. The pain in her ankle was a distant thing, overshadowed by the awe, the shame, and the dawning, terrifying weight of what he had just done. Ayoka climbed up after him, moving with an easy, animal grace. She stood over him. She offered him the rifle. He shook his head, not opening his eyes. You carry it. You are faster. You are stronger." She accepted. She held his rifle. And she understood. He was not her captive. He was not her enemy. He was theirs. They reached the farm just as the sky was turning a pale, sickly gray. The sod house was a dark, silent square, more grave than home. The cornfield was dead, the stalks rattling in the dawn wind. "This way," Elias whispered. He led them to the side of the house, his arm around Neshoba's waist, supporting her. He pulled aside a pile of rotting burlap, revealing the heavy, angled trapdoor to the root cellar. He heaved, his muscles screaming, and lifted it. The smell of damp earth, of withered potatoes and cool dust, rose up to meet them. "Get in," he said. Ayoka slipped down the ladder first, the rifle held high. Elias carefully, agonizingly, helped Neshoba down. He followed, pulling the heavy door closed over their heads, plunging them into a cool, velvety darkness. For a long time, they just breathed. The air was close, but it was safe. Elias found a match and lit a tallow candle he had stored on a shelf. The small, flickering flame illuminated their faces. They were filthy, exhausted, and hunted. They stayed there all day. The cellar was small, lined with shelves of empty jars and sacks of soft, sprouting potatoes. Elias had a small keg of water and some dried jerky. They ate, and they listened. The world above them was silent. In the late afternoon, Elias slowly, carefully, lifted the door. He peered out. The world was empty. The sun was low, casting long, peaceful shadows. "It is clear," he said. He helped Neshoba up, her face tight with pain. He carried her into the one-room house and set her on his cot. He went to his well and drew a fresh bucket of water, binding her ankle with clean rags torn from a sheet. Ayoka came up last, the rifle never leaving her hand. She stood in the doorway, scanning the horizon, her body tense, a wild thing brought to bay. Elias walked past her, his limp pronounced on the flat ground. He went to the 2 small wooden crosses under the skeletal mesquite tree. The smaller one had begun to lean. He knelt, his bad legs sticking out, and packed the dirt firmly around its base. The sisters watched him. They came out, drawn by the quiet sadness of the act. Neshoba limped, leaning on Ayoka's shoulder. They stood beside him, 2 dark shadows in the fading light, looking at the graves. Elias touched the larger cross. "Sarah, my wife." His voice was thick. He touched the smaller one. "Thomas, my son." Ayoka looked at the small grave, her face softening. This, she understood, this was the language of her people, too, the language of loss. Elias looked up, his eyes meeting theirs. The gulf between their worlds seemed, for a moment, to close. "They were gentle," he said, the words heavy in his throat. They never wanted to hurt anyone." He looked at Ayoka, then at Neshoba, at their tired, haunted faces. "Like you." They moved into the house as night fell. For the sisters, it was an alien world. The heavy black iron stove, the solid glass window, unbroken. The bed, raised off the floor on a frame. Neshoba, her ankle propped on a stool, touched everything, her fingers tracing the pattern on a tin cup, the rough weave of his wool blanket, the strange, cold surface of a small, cracked mirror. Ayoka was more guarded, but Elias saw her run her hand over the smooth, planed wood of his small table, a luxury she had never known. He saw how dirty they were, their skin caked with mud and sweat. He filled his large tin bathing basin with water from the well and set it on the stove to heat. "You should wash," he said. He poured the hot water into the basin, adding a bucket of cold. "The water's warm," he gestured, offering them the privacy of the house. "I will. Stand guard. Outside." He took the rifle from Ayoka, and she let him, their hands brushing. He went outside and sat on the small porch, his back to the door, watching the empty prairie. He heard the quiet, nervous splashes as Neshoba bathed first. Then, the sounds changed. It was Ayoka's turn. He sat, the rifle across his knees, listening to the quiet movements. The sun was gone, the sky a deep, bruised purple. A chill wind was rising. He turned, just to check that the door was secure. It was not. It was cracked open, just an inch, a sliver of warm, yellow light cutting the darkness. He saw her. Ayoka. She was standing by the basin, her back to him. Her long, black hair was wet, plastered to her skin. She was naked. His first instinct was to turn away, his face burning. It was a violation, but his eyes were caught by her back. It was not the smooth, brown skin he had imagined. It was a map of healed wounds, a series of old, white, puckered lines, parallel and stark, the marks of a whip. Near her shoulder, a dark, round, ugly scar, the size of a silver dollar. A brand, as if she felt his gaze. She turned. Slowly, she faced him, her body fully visible in the cracked doorway. Her eyes locked on his. Elias's breath caught. He could not move. She did not cover herself. She did not scream, or reach for a knife, or show any shame. She just stood there, her head high, her small, hard body exposed. She let him look. She let him see the evidence of her past, the marks the white man had left on her. It was not an invitation. It was a challenge, a silent, defiant testimony. "This is what your people do. This is who I am. Can you see me?" He held her gaze. His heart was a hammer in his chest. He was not seeing a naked woman. He was seeing her. He was seeing her history, her pain, her impossible, unbreakable strength. He gave a small, slow nod. a nod not of a man looking at a woman, but of an equal, acknowledging her truth. Then he turned his back, facing the dark prairie, his hands trembling. That night, Ayoka's defenses, worn down by the journey, by the graves, by the shared, terrible intimacy of her scars, finally began to crumble. Neshoba was in a deep, exhausted sleep on the cot, her breath peaceful. Elias sat at the table, the rifle in pieces, meticulously cleaning the mud and rust from the action. Ayoka sat across from him, stitching a tear in her moccasin by the light of the single candle. The small house was quiet, peaceful. "Elias," she said. Her voice was so soft he almost did not hear it. He stopped his work, looking up. "Yes." She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on her stitching. "My sister, she is young. She wants. She does not know what she wants. She sees you. You are kind. She has never seen a kind man." "I know," he said quietly. Ayoka's hands stopped moving. She set the moccasin on the table. She looked up. Her dark eyes, which had held so much hate, were now just deep and tired and afraid. Not her," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "If I wanted to lie beside you, would you run?" The question hung in the small, warm room, more naked than her body had been. It was the question of a woman who had only known violence and rejection, asking if he was just another man who would take, or perhaps worse, a man who would run from the complication of her scars, of her race, of the war that was coming for them. Elias put the cleaning rag down. He looked at his own scarred hands, then at her face. He saw the woman who had tended his wounds, who had held his rifle, who had stood, scarred and defiant. In the firelight, he thought of his vow in the mountains. "No," he said. His voice was a low, steady rumble. "Absolute. I would not run." She held his gaze, and for the first time, he saw the woman behind the warrior. He saw her believe him. A quiet, aching moment settled between them, thick and heavy. It was not passion. It was something more fragile and more profound. It was recognition. Slowly, her hands shaking, Ayoka reached across the small table. She did not grab his hand. She extended one finger and touched, just the very tip, the large, scarred knuckle on his right hand, the one Neshoba had traced, a single, trembling point of contact. Elias did not flinch. He did not pull away. He did not cover her hand with his. He just let her. He breathed, slowly, in and out. His skin burned where she touched him. She pulled her hand back, as if the contact was too much. The moment was broken, but the world had changed. The next day, a strange, fragile peace held them. Elias found a small store of flour and jerky. Ayoka, her movements lighter, went to the creek and found wild greens and onions. Neshoba, her ankle propped, sat in the sun outside the door, her hands busy weaving a small, intricate basket from the creek reeds. That evening, they shared a real meal, a thick, hot stew of jerky and greens, with flat, heavy bread that Elias cooked on the stovetop. They sat at the table. Elias even found a can of peaches he had been saving for a day that had never come. He opened it with his knife. He divided the sweet, syrupy fruit into 3 tin cups. Neshoba tasted it, her eyes going wide at the strange, preserved sweetness. She made a small face, then smiled, and Ayoka laughed, a real, quiet, unguarded sound. Elias watched them, in the warm light of his own home, with the smell of stew and peaches in the air. His heart felt a fullness he had thought was buried forever. It was almost peaceful. The sound of a horse's whinny shattered it. Elias was on his feet, grabbing the reassembled rifle. Ayoka was instantly at the door, pulling Neshoba back, out of sight. "Cavalry," Elias whispered, peering through a crack in the sod wall. Not one, a dozen. They were fanning out, a blue line of death, surrounding the small house, and at their head, on a mule, was the trapper. Silas Shuck, pointing. "He's in there! Captain, I told you, the squaw lover is in there!" "The cellar," Ayoka hissed. No, Elias said, his mind racing. They'll look there, under the floor. He kicked his cot aside, revealing the loose planking of the floorboards. In here, it's tight, but they won't look. He tore the boards up. A dark, spider-webbed crawl space. Now! Ayoka helped the whimpering Neshoba into the dark space. She looked back at Elias, her face pale. He pushed the rifle into her hands. No, Elias, if they find you, fight, he commanded. Do not let them take you. Ayoka's eyes widened. He was arming her against his own people. She took the rifle, her jaw set. She slipped into the darkness. Elias shoved the boards back, kicked the cot over them, threw a blanket on top. Elias Harper! The voice from outside was loud, arrogant. Captain Brody. Come out, traitor, or we burn you out. Elias took one last look at his home. He took a deep breath. His hands were empty. He walked to the door and opened it. He limped out onto the porch, squinting into the glare of the setting sun. A dozen carbines were aimed at his chest. Brody sat on his horse, a smug, cruel look on his face. Captain, Elias said, his voice calm. Where are they? Harper? Brody demanded, dismounting. Where are the savages you're hiding? Elias looked at him, then at the trapper, who was smiling his rotten-toothed smile. I don't know what you're talking about. Captain, I'm alone. He's lying, Shuck screamed. I seen 'em. They're in there. I'm alone, Elias repeated, his voice flat. This is my land. I'm a farmer. Brody walked up to him, his face inches from Elias's. He smelled of whiskey and horse sweat. We found the tracks. We found the hair. We know you've been harboring them. You're a race traitor, boy. I'm alone. The punch came from the side, a beefy corporal, stepping forward. His fist, with a heavy ring on it, smashed into Elias's mouth. The world exploded in white light. Elias staggered back, his head hitting the sod wall with a dull thud. He tasted the sharp, metallic tang of copper, blood. It filled his mouth, spilled over his split lip, and dripped, dark and red, onto the front of his shirt, under the floorboards, in the suffocating darkness. Neshoba heard the wet, solid smack of the blow. She heard Elias's pained grunt, a desperate, terrified sound, half scream, half sob, tore from her throat. Instantly, Ayoka's hand clamped over her sister's mouth, smothering the sound. Her other hand gripped the rifle, her eyes burning in the pitch black, staring up at the floorboards, waiting. She held her sister, pressing her face into her shoulder, her own heart a cold, killing stone in her chest. Elias tasted the blood and dirt, spitting a thick, dark stream onto the porch floor. He leaned against the sod wall, his head spinning, the world a blur of blue uniforms and the setting sun. Captain Brody stepped back, wiping his glove on his trousers, his face a mask of disgust. You're harboring savages. Harper, you are a traitor to your race, and we will find them. I am alone, Elias whispered again, his split lip making the words thick and clumsy. Tear it apart, Brody ordered, gesturing to the house. The soldiers needed no second invitation. They stormed the small home, the sound of a heavy boot kicking in the door echoing across the empty yard. They were not searching. They were destroying. Under the floorboards, in the suffocating, dust-filled darkness, Ayoka and Neshoba pressed themselves flat against the cold earth. They heard the crash of the table flipping, the shattering of the glass window, the metallic clang as the iron stove was overturned. A soldier, heavy and cursing, walked over the boards directly above them. Dirt sifted down, falling into their hair. Their eyes. Neshoba was trembling so violently she was almost convulsing, her face buried in Ayoka's shoulder, her hand still clamped over her own mouth. Ayoka was perfectly still. She held the heavy Springfield rifle, the barrel pressed against the planks, her finger on the trigger. She was a single, coiled muscle of hate, waiting. She could kill the one above her. One shot, but there were too many. She waited. There's nothing here, Captain, a soldier yelled. Just a pigsty. No sign of 'em. Brody swore, his frustration visible. He looked at Elias, who was still slumped against the wall. If they're not here, they're close. You were feeding them. Trapper, Brody barked. You're sure? Silas Shuck, who had been watching with a gleeful hunger, nodded eagerly. I seen 'em. Captain, I swear it. Maybe they ran when they saw you coming. Brody turned back to Elias. He won't talk here. He grabbed Elias by the front of his bloody shirt and hauled him to his feet. Elias's bad leg buckled, but Brody held him up. Bind his hands. We're taking him in. A corporal tied Elias's wrists with a rawhide thong, pulling it so tight the circulation stopped. What about the farm, Captain? The corporal asked. Brody looked at the meager, dead cornfield, at the small, defiant sod house. An example, he said. He pulled a torch from a saddle pack, lit it with a match, and tossed it onto the dry stalks of Elias's field. The fire caught instantly, a whoosh of orange flame that devoured the dry corn. The wind fanned it, sending a plume of acrid, black smoke into the twilight sky. Let's ride, Brody said, mounting his horse. They tied Elias's lead rope to a saddle horn and started off at a hard trot. Elias, his hands bound, his leg useless, was forced to stumble, hop, and run, dragged behind the horse like an animal. They left the farm burning, under the floor. The heat grew. The smell of the smoke was overpowering. Ayoka waited. She counted. She listened until the last sound of the horse's hooves faded into the prairie. She pushed at the floorboards. They were stuck, the cot still partially on top. She used the rifle butt, slamming it against the wood, and shoved. The boards gave way. She scrambled out into the smoke-filled, ruined house. The air was thick. The heat from the burning field was intense. She pulled Neshoba out. The younger sister was covered in dirt, her face streaked with tears and grime. She looked at the wreckage of the small, safe home and let out a single, broken wail. Be silent, Ayoka commanded, her voice like flint. She pulled Neshoba to the door. They ran, Ayoka half carrying, half dragging her sister, whose broken ankle was now a swollen, useless burden. They scrambled to the small cluster of trees by the creek, the same trees that held the graves. From the darkness, they watched. The field burned, a terrible, bright wound on the dark land. They watched the column of cavalry, a dark snake, disappear toward the faint, distant lights of Tucson. And at the end of that snake, they could just make out the figure of Elias, a smaller shadow being dragged away from his home, from his wife, from his son, from them. Helpless, they watched him go. The ride to town was a blur of pain. By the time they reached the main street, Elias's boots were gone, his feet raw and bloody, his bad leg a single, screaming nerve. They dragged him through the center of town, past the saloons and the land office, a spectacle for the townsfolk. They didn't take him to a cell. Not at first. They hauled him to the Army stockade, a patch of hard-packed dirt behind the marshal's office, and tied his bound hands to a hitching post. Captain Brody, his face dark with whiskey and authority, stood before him. I will ask you one last time. Harper, where are they? Elias lifted his head. His mouth was caked in dried blood. He looked through Brody, his eyes fixed on some point in the darkness. He said nothing. He's stubborn, Brody said to his men, who had gathered in a circle. He thinks his savage women are worth more than his own kind. He nodded to the corporal. Teach him a lesson. Find his tongue. The beating was not done with anger. It was done with a cold, methodical purpose. The corporal, the same one who had punched him, went first. A fist to the gut that drove the air from Elias's lungs. Another to the ribs. Elias doubled over, held up only by the rope on his wrists. Another soldier stepped in, using his open hand, slapping Elias hard across the face, snapping his head back. Where are they? Elias gasped, spitting blood. He said nothing. They hit him again. They kicked his bad leg. He cried out, a high, thin sound of pure agony. From the edge of the street, a crowd had gathered, men from the saloons, merchants closing their shops. They watched. A man in a black, long coat pushed his way to the front. It was Reverend Gideon, the town's self-appointed moral compass. Stop this, Captain, the preacher said, his voice ringing with false piety. Brody, surprised, turned. He's a traitor, Reverend. He's been living in sin with Apache squaws. He's an animal. Exactly, Gideon said, his eyes bright and feverish as he looked at Elias's broken form. He is an abomination. A beating is not what he requires. This filth, it is a stain on our town. It is a disease. He pointed a long, pale finger at Elias. He has consorted with the heathen. He has turned his back on his God and his race. He does not deserve a beating. He requires a cleansing. He turned to the crowd, his voice rising to a pulpit shout. The good book says the wages of sin is death. This man has brought the shadow of the savage into our homes. He has endangered our women, our children. He must be cut out. The crowd, which had been merely curious, now grew restless, fearful. The preacher was giving their fear a name. A hanging, someone shouted from the back. The cry was picked up. Hang him! Hang the traitor! Reverend Gideon smiled, a thin, satisfied expression. He looked at Captain Brody. The voice of the people, Captain, the voice of God. Remove this stain from our sight. Captain Brody looked at the crowd. He looked at Elias, who was barely conscious. A hanging was fast. It was clean. It made an example. It was precisely what he had intended. He's right, Brody declared, his voice loud. He's a traitor to the army and to his people. We'll hang him at dawn. The crowd roared its approval. Brody nodded to his men. Throw him in the cell. See, he's still here in the morning. The soldiers cut Elias down. He collapsed into the dirt. They grabbed him by the arms and dragged him, his useless legs leaving 2 trails in the dust, to the small, windowless adobe cell behind the marshal's office. They threw him on the packed earth floor and slammed the heavy wooden door, the bolt scraping shut with a sound of finality. But the word spread. Not everyone had been in the mob. In the general store, the proprietor, a man named Hatcher, shook his head as he locked his door. Harper, he said to his wife. He was quiet, always paid in cash, sad-eyed man, never hurt anyone. They say he was with Indians, his wife whispered, pulling her shawl tight. I don't care who he was with, Hatcher grumbled. He didn't deserve that, not a hanging. Brody and that preacher. They've just stirred the snakes. Others spit in the dust. Good riddance, a cowhand said in the saloon, pocketing his winnings. One less mouth to feed, and one less traitor. The town was divided, but the fear and the bloodlust had won. Ayoka and Neshoba moved only when the last glow of the fire had died, and the moon was high and cold. They traveled south, toward the lights of the town, a place Ayoka had sworn never to see again. Neshoba's ankle was a nightmare. She could not put weight on it. Ayoka made a brace from the branches of the mesquite tree, binding it with strips of her own blanket. She supported her sister, and they moved. They moved barefoot. Their moccasins were too soft for the long journey, and the bare, calloused soles of their feet made less noise, left less of a print on the hard, rocky ground. It was slow. It was agony. Every step for Neshoba was a jolt of pain. Every step for Ayoka was a test of strength, supporting her sister, carrying the rifle. But they were driven by the image of Elias, dragged and broken. They reached the outskirts of Tucson just hours before dawn. The town was asleep, save for the low rumble of voices from the Pima saloon. Ayoka pulled them into the deep shadow of an alleyway, between the blacksmith and the saddlery. The town smelled of horse manure, stale whiskey, and white men. Stay here, Ayoka whispered. Do not move. She crept out, a shadow among shadows, moving toward the sound of the voices. She needed to know where they had taken him. She saw him, Silas Shuck, the trapper. He was stumbling out of the saloon, a bottle in his hand, his voice loud and bragging. Told him, I did, $10 silver and a bottle. I found the bastard. Found him for him. They're hanging him at dawn. Hanging the squaw lover. He turned, fumbling with his trousers, and disappeared into the dark alley right across from where Ayoka was hidden. Ayoka turned back to the shadows where she had left her sister, but Neshoba was gone. A flash of pure, cold panic seized Ayoka. She looked toward the alley. She saw a shadow detach itself from the wall. Nashoba. She was moving fast, her limp forgotten, her broken ankle fueled by pure, white-hot rage. The trapper was relieving himself against the adobe wall, still muttering to himself. "Hang him high!" Nashoba did not make a sound. She came up behind him. She did not hesitate. She did not waver. She pulled the long, flint-skinning knife from her belt. Ayoka started to move, to call out, but it was too late. Nashoba grabbed a handful of the trapper's greasy hair. Yanking his head back, before he could make a sound, she drew the blade across his throat. It was not a stab. It was a cut, deep and final. A hot, dark spray. The trapper's eyes went wide, a look of profound, stupid surprise. He made a wet, gurgling sound, his hands flying to his neck, dropping the bottle, which smashed on the ground. Nashoba shoved him, and he collapsed, twitching, into the filth of the alley. He was dead before he stopped moving. She stood over him, breathing hard, her chest heaving, the bloody knife in her hand. The girl who had been curious, who had been afraid, was gone. In her place was a killer. Ayoka was at her side. She looked at the dead man, then at her sister. Nashoba's face was terrifying. It was calm. It was satisfied. Ayoka did not waste time. She grabbed her sister's arm. "Now they will hunt us, too." She looked at the body. The trapper was wearing a thick canvas coat. It was cold. She pulled the coat off the still warm body, wincing at the blood. But taking it, they would need it. She wiped Nashoba's knife clean on the dead man's shirt. "Come, we find Elias." They found the marshal's office. A single soldier sat on a chair by the door, his carbine leaning against the wall, his head tipped back. Dozing, Ayoka looked at the rifle in her hands, then at her knife. The rifle was too loud. She handed it to Nashoba. "If he moves, shoot him." She slipped into the shadow of the building. Moving like smoke, she came up behind the soldier. He never woke up. Her hand clamped over his mouth. Her knife, the one that had skinned the deer, found the space between his ribs. Once, hard. He stiffened, a muffled sound, and she held him until he went limp, lowering him silently to the ground. She took his carbine, his keys, and his cartridge belt. She found the cell door. The bolt was heavy, but she put her shoulder to it, and it scraped back. The door opened with a groan. The cell was pitch black. It smelled of blood, urine, and despair. "Elias?" she whispered. A low groan from the floor. A shape in the corner. She found him. She lit a match from the soldier's pocket. His face was a ruin. Swollen, cut, his eyes purple, his lips split wide open. He was barely conscious. "Ayoka," he breathed. It was not a word. It was a prayer. "We go." She and Nashoba hauled him to his feet. He screamed, a muffled, terrible sound, as his weight came down on his raw feet and his beaten body. I cannot walk." "You will," Ayoka said. She put his arm over her shoulder. Nashoba took his other side. The canvas coat, still smelling of Shuck's whiskey, was put on Elias. They were three broken figures, supporting each other, staggering into the pre-dawn darkness. They were halfway across the main street when a dog started barking. A light came on in the saloon. A man shouted, "The guard! The guard is dead! The prisoner is gone!" An alarm bell started to ring. A frantic, clanging sound that split the night. "Run!" Ayoka hissed. They ran, a stumbling, lurching, agonizing flight. Elias was being dragged, his feet leaving bloody smears on the dirt road. Dogs. They heard the baying of hounds, set on their trail. They fled into the hills, back toward the high country, the shouts and the barking growing closer behind them. They did not stop until the sun was up, until they were high in the rocks, in a small, hidden cave Ayoka had used as a child. Elias collapsed the moment they got inside. He was done. He lay on the cold stone floor, shivering, bleeding, broken. The sisters, their own pain forgotten, went to work. They had water in their skins. They tore strips from the dead trapper's shirt and Ayoka's own blanket. They gently, tenderly, washed the blood and grime from his face, from his feet. Every touch was a fresh agony. Elias watched them through a slit of his swollen eye. He saw Ayoka's grim, focused face. He saw Neshoba, her eyes dark, no longer curious, but hard. A woman's eyes. They had killed for him. They had come back for him. He had brought them nothing but ruin. He had lost his farm, his freedom, and now he had made them murderers. Outcasts from their world, and his Ayoka was binding his ribs. He looked at her. I am not strong anymore," he whispered. The words tore from his chest, a confession of his deepest failure. He had nothing left. He could not protect them. He could not even stand. A single tear cut a clean path through the blood and dirt on his cheek. Ayoka stopped. She looked at his face. She saw not weakness, but a man stripped bare, a man who had given everything, who had taken a beating to protect them. She leaned down. Her face was inches from his. She saw his pain, his shame, his despair. She kissed him. It was not the curious peck of her sister. It was not a kiss of romance. It was a hard, possessive, bruising kiss. It was a kiss of shared blood, of desperation, of defiance. It was a brand. She was claiming what was hers, what she had fought for. Her mouth was hard against his broken lips, and he tasted her, the sage and the smoke, and he tasted his own blood. She pulled back, her black eyes boring into his. "You are strong," she said, her voice a low command. "You are alive. That is strong." That night, the boundaries were gone. The fire they built was small, but it filled the cave with a warm, dancing light. They were fugitives. They were hunted. They were, perhaps, already dead. Nothing was left but the simple, terrible truth. They huddled together, not just for warmth, but for life. The kiss had broken the last dam. Elias lay by the fire, his body a map of pain. Ayoka lay beside him, her head on his shoulder, her hand on his chest, as if guarding his heartbeat. Neshoba, her sister's anger gone, her vengeance complete, lay on his other side, her head resting on his arm, her hand gripping his. Grief, passion, and a desperate, agonizing love swirled between them in the shadows. It was not a sin, it was a healing. They moved, their whispers soft in the dark, their hands trembling as they explored the wounds of the others. Firelight danced across bare skin, across the scars on Ayoka's back, the cuts on Elias's face, the bruises on Neshoba's arms. They came together, a tangle of broken limbs and shattered pasts, finding in their shared closeness a profound, unspoken solace. They were three people at the end of the world, with nothing left but each other, and in that, they found everything. Elias held them, one in each arm, their hair a dark, soft shroud over his broken chest. He felt their hearts beating, one fast, one slow. In time with his, he looked up at the roof of the cave, the firelight making the shadows dance like spirits. "Let them call it sin," he whispered into the darkness, his voice thick and raw. "You are my life now." Winter came down from the high peaks like a wolf, lean and hungry. The world turned to iron and ice. The wind was a constant scream, driving snow into the rock fissures, erasing the world, erasing their trail. Survival became a thing of minutes, of a single piece of dry wood, of the warmth of another body. They were ghosts. They moved only in the teeth of the blizzards, when no soldier would ride. Elias, his body mended by the sisters' care, his limp a permanent, aching part of him, became their hunter. He set snares, his hands, clumsy with cold, learning the Apache knots Ayoka taught him. They trapped rabbits, grouse, and once a half-starved coyote. When the traps were empty, they stole. They descended from the mountains under the cover of the new moon, a trinity of shadows. They found lonely line shacks, unguarded supply depots for the railroad, or the ranches of men who had grown careless. Elias would go in, his white face less of an alarm. He would take flour, salt, bacon, cartridges. He never took more than they could carry, never more than would be missed for a week. He was stealing back the life that had been stolen from him. Their bond, forged in the fire of the jailbreak and the desperation of the escape, deepened. It was no longer a thing of stolen glances or fearful questions. It was raw, immediate, and unshakable. There was no shame in the cold darkness of their shelters. They slept as one, a tangle of limbs, sharing breath, sharing the last vestiges of their heat. Intimacy was their only shield against the cold, their closeness a defiant act against a world that wanted them frozen and apart. There was no modesty left. Elias would hold Ayoka's bare feet against his own stomach, trying to rub life back into them. She would tend to the scars on his back, the raw, rope-burned flesh of his wrists. Her touch no longer hesitant, but firm, possessive. Nashoba. Her ankle healed but her spirit still scarred, would lie between them, a protected, warm center, her hands gripping both of theirs. In the endless, snowbound days, they taught each other. Ayoka, seeing his frustration with the silent world, began to teach him her language. She would point, Zil, mountain, Tlo, grass, Ndi, the people. He tried, his mouth clumsy around the clicks and the soft, guttural sounds, but he learned. He learned the word for pain, for hungry. He learned the word for safe, Hozoni. He learned the word for home, and she pointed not at a place, but at the three of them, huddled under the blankets. Nashoba, her fire returning, found bright berries and the feathers of a blue jay. She would sit for hours, weaving them into her dark hair, a splash of defiant color against the gray rock. She wove them into Ayoka's hair too, and even tried to tie one to Elias's beard until he grunted, and a sound startled them all. He was laughing, a quiet, rusty sound, torn from his chest. Nashoba stared, her eyes wide, and then she smiled. Ayoka looked at him, her own lips twitching, and they laughed. The sound was shocking in the frozen silence. A small, bright pocket of life. It felt more intimate than a kiss. The danger, however, was as constant as the cold. One gray afternoon, Elias was checking a line of snares near a frozen creek. He had 2 rabbits, their bodies already stiff. He was resetting a trap when a shadow fell over him. He did not look up. He had felt the presence. He finished tying the knot. "Stand up, traitor, slowly." It was a soldier, not from Brody's troop, but a different company. A lone tracker, gaunt and hard, his eyes the color of the ice. His carbine was leveled at Elias's chest. "Been tracking you for a week," the soldier said, his voice rough. "Knew you was alive, knew you'd be sloppy. Get your hands up." Elias stood, his hands raised. The rabbits dangled from his belt. "Where are the squaws?" the soldier demanded. Stepping closer, "In a hole, waiting for you." "I am alone," Elias said, his voice calm. The soldier laughed. "A dry hack. That's what you said last time, and it got your farm burned." He gestured with the rifle. "We'll just walk back to your camp, and you'll watch what we do to em. Then we'll hang you." From the rocks above, a stone clicked. The soldier's head snapped up. It was all the time Elias needed. He was not a farmer anymore. He moved, his bad leg anchoring him as he pivoted, and he drove his body forward, under the rifle, striking the soldier's chin with his head. The rifle went off, the shot a deafening blast that echoed in the narrow gulch. The soldier staggered, but he was strong, bringing the rifle butt around, catching Elias in the ribs. Elias fell, the air driven from him. Ayoka and Nashoba were scrambling down the rocks. The soldier saw them, his eyes wide with triumph. He raised the rifle again, this time at Nashoba, who was closer, her footing unsure on the ice. "No!" Elias screamed. The soldier fired. Nashoba cried out, a high, thin sound, and she collapsed, clutching her leg. Not the ankle she had broken before, her thigh, a dark, blossoming stain on the deer hide. The soldier turned to Ayoka, working the lever of the carbine. He was too slow. Elias, with a roar that was not human, launched himself from the ground. He hit the soldier's knees. They both went down. The soldier was a trained killer, but Elias was a desperate man. It was not a fight, it was a butchering. Elias's hands, which had farmed and mended and held, were now claws. He grabbed the soldier's head, slamming it against the frozen, bloody rock. Once, twice. He felt the man's skull give. He didn't stop. He was shouting, the same word, over and over, a raw, guttural sound. He was still hitting the man when Ayoka's hands grabbed his shoulders, pulling him back. "Elias! He is dead! He is dead!" Elias stopped. He looked down. The soldier's face was gone, a red ruin on the ice. He looked at his own hands, caked in blood and gore. He fell back, away from the body, and was sick, his body convulsing. He had killed. Not in the heat of war, not in defense. He had murdered. His hands, they were shaking. He could not make them stop. He looked at them, his body's betrayal, with a stranger's horror. Ayoka did not go to her sister. Not first. She went to Elias. She knelt in front of him, ignoring the corpse. She grabbed his shaking hands, her grip iron. She held them, pressing them between her own, forcing them still. "You saved her," she said, her voice a fierce command. "You saved us. This is not a sin. This is life. Do not shame yourself." He looked at her, his eyes wild. Then he heard it. Neshoba. She was sobbing, a low, keening wail of pain. They rushed to her. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of her thigh. It was bleeding, but it had missed the bone. It was a miracle, but she could not walk. They carried her back to the shelter, leaving the soldier for the wolves. That night, the debate was short and terrible. They were no longer ghosts. The army knew they were here. They knew they were armed. They would come now, not with a patrol, but with a company. "They will find us," Ayoka said, her face grim as she packed the last of the jerky. "They will follow the blood. I will go east. I will draw them. Elias, you take Neshoba. You go west. Hide. I will find you when it is safe." Neshoba was crying, her face pale with blood loss. "No, they will find me. Do not leave me." Elias looked at them, the two women who were his entire world, splintering apart, sacrificing themselves. He thought of his vow. He thought of his farm, of his dead wife and son, of a life spent running, of a life spent alone. "No," he said. They both looked at him. "No more running," he said, his voice flat, but with a core of new, hard iron. "No more splitting up. They hunted me when I was alone. They hunt us now. It does not matter. We are one. We live or we die. Together." Ayoka stared at him. It was a fool's plan. It was suicide. But it was also the first time in her life she had not been alone. "Where?" she whispered. "Where? Elias. The world is white. There is nowhere left." He looked at her. "You said, your people. Is there no one? No one left?" Ayoka's face closed. "There is one, my mother's brother, my uncle. He lives in the highest peaks, the place the soldiers call the Devil's Crown." "Will he help us?" Elias asked. "He helps no one," Ayoka said. "He refused the reservation. He refused to surrender. He fought until his own warriors left him. Our people say he is a ghost, that he talks to the spirits. He is an outcast. He will kill you just for being white." "Will he kill you?" Elias asked. Ayoka hesitated. "He loved my mother. I do not know." "Then we go to him," Elias said. "He is our only chance. We live or die together." The journey to the Devil's Crown was a vision of hell. Elias carried Neshoba on his back, his rifle and the soldier's carbine slung over his chest. Ayoka carried their supplies, her own knife, and the soldier's pistol. They moved through waist-deep snow, Elias's bad leg a constant, agonizing fire. But he did not stop. He was fueled by a strength that was not his own. They found the uncle's camp. It was not a camp. It was a fortress of rock and ice, a cave hidden behind a frozen waterfall. He was waiting for them. He was a man who looked more like the mountain than a human. Tall, gaunt, his hair long and white, his face a map of 100 winters. He held a U.S. Army rifle, and he aimed it at Elias's heart. Ayoka stepped in front of Elias. She spoke, her voice urgent. In Apache, she told him of Brody, of the jail, of the dead trapper, of the soldier on the ice. She told him Nashoba was shot. The old man's eyes never left Elias. He listened. When she was done, he said one word to her. Why? Ayoka looked back at Elias, who stood, exhausted, holding her sister. Because he is ours, she said, her voice clear. The uncle was silent for a long time. He looked at Nashoba's bleeding leg. He looked at Elias's ruined face. He lowered the rifle. Bring her in, he said in perfect, unaccented English. He looked at Elias. You wait. For 2 days. Elias waited outside the cave, in the howling wind. He was not allowed inside by the fire. He sat, his blanket wrapped around him, slowly freezing. Ayoka brought him scraps of food, her face full of fear. On the 3rd morning, the uncle emerged. He looked at Elias, who was half conscious, his beard thick with frost. She says you are a man, the uncle said. I see. A dog. A white dog. Beaten by its masters. Elias, with a strength he did not know he possessed, got to his feet. He stood, swaying, but he stood. I am not a dog, he forced through blue, cracked lips. The uncle's eyes showed a flicker of interest. My people are dead. My world is dead. The white man killed it. Why should I let you live? To stain the last safe place? I have no people, Elias said, his voice a raw whisper. I have them. He gestured to the cave. The uncle grunted. If you are to stay, you must be new. The white man must die. We will see what is left. The test was not a test. It was a breaking. For a day, he was left by the fire, to sweat, to purify. Ayoka was not allowed to speak to him. Then, for 3 days, he was given no food and only a cup of bitter water. He was sent into a small, dark hole in the rock, to wait, to listen, to face what came. He was hungry. He was weak. The darkness was total, and the ghosts came. He saw Sarah, her face pale and sad. She looked at him, huddled in the dark. You ran, she whispered. I know, he whispered back. You left me. You left Thomas. I did. I am sorry. She did not accuse him. She just watched him. And then she smiled, a small, sad smile. But you are not alone anymore. Go, live, Elias. And she faded. He saw Thomas, his small, 4-year-old body. By the creek, the boy was holding the small, wooden boat. He looked at Elias and he waved. He did not speak. He just waved. And then he, too, was gone. He saw the soldier he had killed, his face a red ruin. The soldier pointed at him. Traitor! Yes, Elias said to the darkness. I am... He saw Captain Brody and Reverend Gideon, their faces twisted in hate. Abomination! Yes, Elias said. I am that, too. He was not afraid. He was just finished. The old Elias Harper, the farmer, the soldier, the grieving husband, was dead. He had died in the jail, or on the ice, or here, in this small, dark hole. He did not know. He only knew that when he opened his eyes, he was empty. He was pulled out, blinking, into the weak sunlight. He was gaunt. His eyes sunk deep in his head, but his gaze was clear. The uncle looked at him. He had seen men break in that hole. He had seen them go mad. This man was quiet. He was whole. The uncle grunted. He took a piece of roasted deer meat from the fire and handed it to Elias. You are not white, the uncle said. You are not Ndi. You are a man of the mountain. You may stay. He passed. They stayed. The winter broke, and a harsh, cold spring washed the snow from the high peaks. The uncle taught Elias how to hunt with a bow, how to read the clouds, how to live without salt or flour. Nashoba recovered. The uncle's medicines and Ayoka's care knitted the flesh. Her leg would be scarred, but she would walk. She would run. Her laughter, no longer a shock, became a regular sound in the high canyon. Ayoka and Elias were inseparable. They hunted together. They sat in the evenings, watching the eagles circle. The passion of their escape had settled into a deep, quiet river of a bond. One night, sitting on a ledge, watching the stars, Ayoka spoke. "He will not live forever," she said, nodding back to the cave where the old man slept. "The soldiers, they will not look here, but this is not a home. This is a grave." Elias looked at her. "What do you want, Ayoka?" She looked at her hands. I want a house, not of sod, of wood, by a stream, a place where we can plant, a place where a child." She did not finish. Elias put his hand over hers. His hand was no longer shaking. It was hard, brown, and steady. "We will," he said. "When Neshoba is strong, we will go north, past the mountains, past the borders. We will find a place where there are no names, no shame." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Just home." "Just home," he agreed. In the final days of that spring, when the world was green and wild, the three of them stood on a high cliff, looking out over the endless valleys. The air was clean. The world below was vast, beautiful, and filled with danger. Neshoba stood beside Elias, her hand tucked in his arm. She was smiling, her face turned up to the sun, the feathers in her hair bright. Ayoka stood on his other side, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her hand resting on the knife at her belt. Elias looked out at the land, at the two women who were his life. He thought of the farm, of the man he had been, the man who had stayed, hoping to die. He knew, now, why he had not, he whispered, his voice caught by the wind. "I stayed because you let me." Neshoba heard him. Her smile widened. Ayoka turned. She looked at his face, at the scars that now matched her own. She slid her hand into his. It fit. They stood there for a long moment. Three outcasts, three survivors. A new, strange, and unbreakable family. Then, together, they turned and walked forward, into danger, into love, into legend. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment and let us know. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to From Wild West and share your thoughts with us in English.